Grace. Welcome to our fourth and our final installment in our series, Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought. A set of four, as I said, conversations we are hosting based on an edited volume of essays by Bernard G. Prusak and Jennifer Reed Booley. The collection is called Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, Critical Constructive Essays, forthcoming from Paulus Press later in 2021. These conversations have been so wonderful. I tell you, they've been edifying and challenging at the same time. So in my mind, that's a constructive engagement. Tonight's conversation with Catherine and Kathleen promises to be more of the same. As mentioned, tonight's event concludes our slate of four conversations, but a few remain in this 13-part series, which is taking place in Zoom spaces all across the country this spring. In fact, there were three today of Bernard and Jennifer's, based on Bernard and Jennifer's fine book. If you want to tune in, please see our web pages for details. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola. And on behalf of Gabrielle Buckley and the Gannon Center for Women in Leadership, who are co-sponsoring these conversations, on behalf of university leadership, and on behalf of the Hank family, whose generous gift supports our wide programming and initiatives, I extend my heartfelt greeting to you. A kind welcome also from our dedicated center staff, Center Manager Megan Toomey and Graduate Student Assistant Kathleen McNutt. Kathleen and Megan are most instrumental in preparing and promoting our events, and I remain ever grateful for their fine work. Tonight's event is called Beyond Patriarchy, Women and Lay Leadership. You know, so many of us this evening are possessed by a deep vocational sense of teaching and learning, and by a profound love for the premise, the project, and the promise of Catholic higher education. The same is particularly true of our speakers tonight. Dr. Punsalan-Manlimos will take us on an excursion, speaking mainly from her experience in women and leadership dynamics at the University of Detroit Mercy. She'll also reflect, though, on the increasing roles and responsibilities of lay men and women, with a focused eye on the remaining obstacles that impede the full participation of lay people in leadership, particularly those of women. Catherine anchors her insights in a constructive reflection on the responsibilities of Catholic colleges and universities in light of their missions, anchored as they are in Catholic social teaching, thought, and practice. Our respondent, Dr. Kathleen Maas Weigert of Loyola University Chicago, has read Dr. Punsalan-Manlimos' points. Indeed, Catherine and Kathleen have been in intimate dialogue on these matters for some years now, and Kathleen will keep it going, and they both will, but Kathleen will provide a response based on her scholarship and her reflection. We all will then spend the rest of our time together thinking about the ways Catholic colleges, their networks, the university networks like AJCU and ACCU, et cetera, might come together to work towards a better embodiment of mission, largely writ, through the resources of Catholic social thought, teaching, and practice, especially based on Catherine's topics. Just a little bit of housekeeping, my usual housekeeping before we begin. First, you saw the slides. So our next event is this Thursday, March 25th. It's our much anticipated St. John Henry Newman lecture, featuring philosopher Jennifer Frey from the University of South Carolina. Dr. Frey's talk, From the Rust Belt to Rome, The Conversion of a Working Class Atheist, is part spiritual autobiography and part philosophical reflection. It's a conversation, a lecture you won't want to miss. It's at 4 p.m. and as always, registration is free. Tell a friend, and we hope to see you. One note, actually 3 notes on our format tonight before I introduce our esteemed guests. Today's Zoomcast is classified as a meeting. This means that while the chat is limited, we use the chat for questions. So please direct your questions or comments to me, and I will integrate them as best I can, as always. I try my best. When you write your comment, this is kind of a new wrinkle, please indicate whether you would like to speak out loud tonight and engage our speakers. So we would unmute you. I would read your question, hopefully in the order I receive it, and then say, hey, this is a good one, or this is one that has a priority, and or is utterly relevant, that kind of thing. And then Megan and Kathleen and I will be unmuting people. So we'll see how it goes. I'm sure it'll go fine, but we want to integrate as many voices as possible and keep this natural, right? We want to have a conversation. So please indicate if you're comfortable or if you'd rather not. I understand that. As always, I encourage you to simply, as you listen, write down any thought you might have. And if it's a question or comment, write it to me right away. That helps me start to organize things. So I appreciate it. If you think it, write it, and that helps. Thank you very much, and I appreciate it. So then, with that, let's welcome our speakers. Catherine Punsalan-Manlimos is Assistant to the President for Mission Integration and Associate Professor in Religious Studies at the University of Detroit Mercy. Previously, Catherine was the Malcolm and Marie, I think it's Marie, I'm sorry, Catherine, if I have it wrong, Malcolm and Marie Stamper Chair in Catholic Intellectual and Cultural Traditions and inaugural director of the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture at Seattle University, where she was also associate professor in theology and religious studies and director of Catholic studies. That's a lot, Catherine. Catherine began her academic career at the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, where she received her Bachelor of Science degree in physics and a master's in theological studies. And she also taught there in the undergraduate and graduate theology program for 5 years. Catherine earned her PhD from the University of Notre Dame in systematic theology in the area of the intersection of religion, science, and the preferential option for the poor. Her current research projects examine the intersections of the Catholic social tradition, Catholic higher education, and the contribution of marginalized voices to scholarship, leadership, in the life of the academy and the church. Welcome, Catherine. Kathleen Maas Weigert is a professor emerita at Loyola University of Chicago, where she taught sociology and peace, justice, and conflict studies programs. Excellent. Among her publications is a co-edited volume, Living the Catholic Social Tradition, Cases and Commentary from 2005. And she co-edited an issue on CST for the Journal of Catholic Higher Education in the winter of 2018. Dr. Maas Weigert is currently co-leading a multi-university research project on how college students learn about and appropriate the Catholic social tradition. A second project that focuses on a new Catholic community organizing group in Chicago. And the third thing, a collaborative book project with 6 colleagues that focuses on women engaging the Catholic social tradition. So that's a lot too, Kathleen, that you're doing at this moment. Hello, Kathleen, again, it's nice to see you. So Catherine's gonna begin, and then seamlessly, Kathleen Maas Weigert will simply respond, and then I'll come back around in to integrate your comments, questions, and we'll go from there. So now, beyond patriarchy, women and lay leadership, welcome Dr. Punsalan-Manlimos. The Zoom stage is yours.
Thanks, Mike. And let me begin by just saying a word of thanks to you, to Megan, and to Kathleen for hosting this series at the Hank Center. And of course, I want to thank Jennifer Reed-Booley and Bernard Pruzak for inviting me to contribute this chapter to the volume that they're co-editing. But I especially want to thank Kathleen for agreeing to be my conversation partner, not only tonight, but as Mike mentioned, throughout thinking about this chapter and actually having the privilege of thinking with her about women in Catholic social thought for that last thing that Mike named among the many things that she's doing. Kathleen, you've helped me sharpen my thinking as well as identify and name the contribution I can make to these kinds of conversations. On the topic of women's leadership, whether in higher education or the development of Catholic social thought, I have learned as much through the community, collaboration, and care I've had the privilege of experiencing with you and other colleagues as any textual research. So for that, I am deeply, deeply grateful and for willing to be my conversation partner tonight. I am going to try to share screen, and let's hope this works. We know that sometimes these do not always work the way we intend. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to get up to make sure I have my different pieces in proper place. And I'm hoping that we've all gotten so accustomed to doing these kinds of things that we're accustomed to seeing people fiddle around. I want to apologize because my son would be very upset with me by the fact that I'm actually created a set of PowerPoints that he probably would think don't fit what a lot of young people think are good PowerPoints these days. As Mike mentioned, I'm really sharing with you from my experiences of feeling both hyper-visible and invisible in many spaces in Catholic higher education, because I'm a woman, a person of color, and an immigrant. And to share with you that I've discovered what I might offer to this conversation through those particular lenses. And quite frankly, women religious and the laity draw from such historical experiences of exclusion and invisibility in the church. And this, I think, allows them to make distinctive contributions as they're called upon to take visible leadership in Catholic higher education. A centralized understanding of womanhood and a clericalist approach to priesthoods created the second-class status of women in the laity for much of the history of the church. But our current historical moment makes us keenly aware of the fact that exclusion deprives society, the church, and Catholic higher education of the gift of so many from marginalized communities. I understand the invitation to contribute to this chapter as an invitation to name, through the lens of Catholic social tradition, some of the gifts that women and lay leaders have brought and can bring more visibly and centrally to the mission of Catholic higher education. So what I'd like to do is to share with you my ongoing reflection on this work in progress and offer some of the pieces that are informing my thinking in the effort to name some of these gifts. I appreciate the fact that we have an opportunity to share our thinking in the midst of completing our chapters. And I thank the Hank Center for making that possible for me tonight. I think it's important for me to share a little bit about my own history, my own social location. Being a woman of color, coming from a working class background, and being immigrant and transcultural, and kind of how that shaped my own reflecting. You know, I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment, if that's all right. I think I'd rather just talk to you, if that's all right. So I came to theology many decades ago when I made this startling discovery as an undergrad, that in the words that I used then, I can be Catholic and think. It was the life of the mind and finding resonance between Catholic social thought and things I cared about. For example, the struggle of farmers, laborers, and the urban poor that attracted me. So when I began to focus more consciously on Catholic higher education, which you can tell from my dissertation in graduate school was not what I was thinking about in my graduate program, I found myself quite excited to delve more deeply into things like the Land O'Lakes Statement and Ex Corde Ecclesia, as well as seminal works of the last four superior generals of the Society of Jesus on Jesuit education, like Pedro Arrupe's Man for Others. I realized we kind of retitled it, but that was his original title. I'm Jesuit educated and I've been at Jesuit institutions, except for my foray with the Congregation of the Holy Cross during my graduate work at Notre Dame. And these texts were exciting for me as a theologian. And it never occurred to me to read these documents with an attention to what is missing, the excluded voices. That is, until the last couple of years since I joined the University of Detroit Mercy, which has the distinction of being sponsored by both the Society of Jesus and the Religious Sisters of Mercy. For example, it never occurred to me to pay attention to who was present at the crafting of the Land O'Lakes Statement, which has had a profound influence on the understanding of Catholic higher education in this country. I'd not paid attention to the fact that the signers of the statement were all men, predominantly clerics from some of the most prominent Catholic institutions. I didn't even pay attention to the care they took to name the context of the statement, the kinds of schools whose concerns would not be included, and those they acknowledged as part of these larger universities, but were not in the conversation. I mentioned the Land O'Lakes Statement because in the slice of the Catholic educational world that I know, this is an important document, marking an important kind of declaration of academic freedom and autonomy. It's important for Catholic institutions of higher learning. Its importance for Catholic institutions of higher learning should not be underestimated. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the concerns of women's colleges, of institutions established by women's religious orders, are totally absent from a pivotal document that has helped shape thinking around Catholic higher education in the United States for the last half year. There's a historical reason for this. These institutions did not go co-ed, many of them, until after the document, Land O'Lake document, was drafted. And the reality is, women's Catholic colleges, even when they numbered at 142 at their peak, continue to be missing from much of the literature on Catholic higher education and higher education more broadly. The volume Women's Catholic Colleges in America, edited by Tracy Shard, Cynthia Ingalls Bressett, begins to rectify this by chronicling this rich history. And I'm going to draw on their work, and it's been informing my own learning around the history of women religious orders and the colleges that they instituted. In it, Jill Kerr-Conway notes that the conventional perception of Catholic women's institutions as, and these are her words, backward-looking agents for fostering middle-class ideals of gentility overlooks their striking capacity to institutionalize ideals of social justice left out or ignored within the higher educational system. The cultural context found in church and American society in the late 19th and early 20th century, during the time during which these institutions began to be established, created both the obstacle and the necessity of their establishment. The cult of domesticity that characterized the understanding of the role of women in both church and society, at best saw the higher education of women as enabling them to be better prepared for marriage and being able to raise good sons. Within the Catholic community, there was resistance to such education, as it may encourage young women to turn away from domestic roles. Besides, there was doubt as to the intellectual ability of women for higher education. Nevertheless, the rise in the socioeconomic status of the increasing number of Catholics meant the desire of more Catholic women to obtain higher education. At the same time, options for these women were only in non-Catholic women's institutions, which were seen as a threat to their faith. This opened the opportunity for the establishment of a number of institutions by women religious communities to serve this underserved community of Catholic women who had been wanting to attain higher education. And this was something that the women religious had wanted to offer long before they were permitted. Bishops who had long failed to see the value of offering higher education for women saw Catholic women's colleges as a way to forestall the threat of these other institutions. They also thought they'd be able to influence the curriculum to encourage these women to still be educated for domestic life, something that many of these colleges were able to resist. Women religious had been in the business of serving underserved communities, even as the composition of these communities shifted over time. They were called upon by bishops to serve poor immigrants through education, healthcare, and other services. They were eventually permitted to serve middle and upper middle class women as more and more did seek higher education. Women religious led many of these colleges with a view to address real needs. But it wasn't just upper middle class women. And allow me to name an example here. We may recall that St. Catherine Drexel and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, who founded Xavier University in Louisiana in 1925, was the first Catholic college to accept not only African-American women, but African-American men, as they too were not accepted at other Catholic colleges and universities at the time. Many of these institutions were established and flourished through the dedication and sacrifice of women religious who not only led, but staffed these institutions for decades, many just doing it as part of being members of these communities and not so much for money. Really, they were endowments of many of these institutions. Thus, changes that took place after Vatican II, which included the sharp decline of the number of women religious, led to the loss of a significant number of these institutions. And while a number closed, and a number disappeared as they joined with larger men's universities, many more innovated and adapted to the shifting environment. Here, still guided by the commitment to serve the underserved. Allow me to offer 3 examples. And again, here I draw on the chapter by Dorothy Brown and Carol Hart Green of the volume I mentioned. Trinity University began as the first Catholic women's liberal arts college in 1897. Founded to educate white middle and upper middle class women, today its student body is predominantly African American and Latina. About 80% of the undergraduate students are eligible for Pell Grants, and about 10% of the undergraduate women are Dreamers, undocumented students with DACA status. Or take, for example, Mount St. Mary's of Los Angeles, founded by the St. Joseph Sisters of Carondelet in 1925. And I'm quoting here Brown and Green. They came early to the realization that respect for and education towards diversity are central components of institutional responsibility to students and the community. And by 1960, the student body reflected the diversity of the city they were in. Today, 75% of the student body itself identifies as Hispanic, Asian or Pacific Islander, or Black, and another 11% as other or multiracial, with 90% of these still women. Finally, the innovation that these institutions made, and I'm just giving you small examples, so many examples of innovation, was not just by diversifying their student body. Take the example of Alverno College, started by the School Sisters of St. Francis as a one-year normal school in 1887. Their adaptation over time included a significant educational innovation under the leadership of Sister Joel Reed, when they would create a curriculum based on outcomes assessment, focusing on who their students are and asking the question of how to attain their desired outcomes for these students. They were willing to turn to corporate America to learn methods of assessment and adapt these to higher education. And they developed teaching methods to attain their desired outcomes. And this was a long process that was undertaken with the faculty and through grants. The model of education is, and I quote here, one in which a student learns her own abilities and her own learning style and overcomes her own resistance. According to Brown and Green, and again I quote, Alverno's success story is one of a combination of strong leadership, an entrepreneurial spirit, and a wise and fortuitous understanding of educational trends. These are but 3 quick examples of how women leaders, guided by the commitment to serve the underserved, adapted to the challenges that they face, which included decreasing enrollment and increasing costs, which might sound familiar for our times. Point of pride for Catholic higher education is the fact that we can currently boast of faring better than the broader US higher educational landscape when it comes to women's leadership. 35 of our Catholic colleges and universities are led, 35% are led by women, while those for all Catholic colleges and universities is 30%. Within the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, there are currently 3 women presidents, including the president of the institution that's hosting us tonight, with the 4th joining the group in July at Xavier. Seattle University and the College of the Holy Cross will be welcoming their first lay presidents in July as well, expanding the number of lay presidents. And I should note, both are men of color. And while Linda Lemura holds the honor of being the first woman who's not avowed religious to lead a Jesuit university in the United States, the honor of being the first woman president belongs to Maureen Fay, a Dominican sister who was president of Mercy College when it merged with the University of Detroit in 1990, and was asked to become the first president of the product of the merger, the University of Detroit Mercy. She was president until 2004. Arguably a consequential move that contributed to the continued vibrant presence of the Mercy charism at the university. And it's through the lens of my 2 years at Detroit Mercy that I want to continue. The merger between Mercy College and the University of Detroit is a rare story of a larger institution not leading to the effective disappearance of the charism of the woman religious order that's merged with it. The merger that led to Detroit Mercy happened some 30 years ago, and today the efforts to mine the riches of dual sponsorship feel like they're entering a new stage. There's a desire to move beyond finding the common denominators between the two charisms, to bringing to light what is shared by both, but at the same time noting what is unique from each charism that makes the institution distinctive. There's currently a conversation among a handful of people with deep knowledge of one or both of the history and charism of the two sponsoring order. And the intent is to identify a process to help Detroit Mercy community name what it means when it claims to be Mercy and Jesuit. And in my own reading and reflecting and reading programs intended to help us prepare to answer the question, I've been fascinated by what I've learned. The story of Ignatius and the story of Catherine Mccauley, the two founders of the religious orders, led such very different lives in very different times and places, and so inspired approaches and reasons for education that were shaped by these experiences. They also came to many things in common. Among these is the holding together of contemplation and action. And attending to their stories reveals what makes this core value different for each. And again, I've just been so fascinated learning Catherine's story against Ignatius's story. First of all, Catherine Mccauley was an Irish Catholic woman who was born during a period when the penal laws were that had been used to oppress, marginalize, and disenfranchise Irish Catholics were just being lifted. While her father was a relatively well-to-do man and did well for his family, many Irish Catholics of the time were impoverished, uneducated, and continued to suffer the consequences of legalized oppression of a people for over a century. While growing up with relative means, she would lose both parents as she began to enter into adulthood, and she would have two siblings with her. They would be cared for by family and friends. But there's always a story that's told about her. When she was 5 years old, she would witness her father attending to the needs of the poor, and this inspired her in her own faith. And in her early 20s, when she was already orphaned and was taken in by the Callahans, who was a Quaker couple, their faith enabled Catherine to continue the work of compassion and care for poor children and women that she had first learned from her father. And she cared for the couple as they grew ill and they passed away. And they left her a small fortune that she used to start the House of Mercy, which was a house that welcomed poor children and vulnerable women who were often working in the homes of the wealthy. I note this because this was her place of encounter with God. This, along with continued prayer and spiritual conversations and readings, would shape Catherine Mccauley's own spirituality, right? And so when she built the House of Mercy and began to attract other women to this particular work, she never had an intention to become a sister, but the circumstances in which she lived forced her to enter religious life to continue the work that she had already understood to be coming from God. But what I really want to highlight is the entry point of caring for the vulnerable as her place of encounter with God. And that direct contact and care is so characteristic of the religious Sisters of Mercy. A very different story, right? For Ignatius, who lived some 3 centuries before Catherine. And he was a young man who lived a life of privilege. Many of us on this call probably know his story better. I noticed some friends from other Jesuit institutions, and that's why I'm making that assumption. He led a privileged life that was kind of cut short by an event in Pamplona, leg shattered by a cannonball. I need to mention we're celebrating the Ignatian year starting in May in recognizing the 500th year anniversary of this pivotal event. But what's most interesting, it was in bed with books and his imagination that God began to do his work in Ignatius. And that's where his conversion experience happened, in solitude, imagination, and prayer. And so God accomplished his work here. And it was from this space that he left behind courtly life to pursue a life of radical simplicity and to share what God had been teaching him through those months as he was healing from his wounds. And of course, this is what helped give birth to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius that many of us know about. In this new state, he too would be drawn to caring for the sick and being among the poor. But more importantly, he wanted to preach and teach the spiritual exercises he had learned as a way to God and interior freedom. But he lived in the time of the Inquisition, and he didn't have the proper credentials to do the work that he was doing, however correct his theology might have been. So he was forced by ecclesial requirements to go to school, which eventually led him to the University of Paris, which eventually led him to the circle of men who would help him found the Society of Jesus. If Catherine's entry into education was starting a house of mercy to provide opportunities for poor women and children, Ignatius's entry into education began with trying to educate other young men who wanted to join the community of the Society of Jesus, and eventually acquiescing to communities that wanted their sons to also be educated. Different starting points, different, if you will, constituents for the education that they offered. I want to note my telling of these two stories is quite impoverished and misses many important details, but I hope there's enough there to show some similarities and important differences between the story of the founders and the consequent founding of the two communities. I'm fascinated by how contemplation and solitude was where God taught Ignatius like a schoolboy, as he would say, and how it was the works of mercy, attending to those in need, where Catherine saw the face of Christ, as in Matthew 25. But in both of these stories, I want to suggest that context is critical. Circumstances and social location shaped the possibilities for each of these persons and led to diverse ways that they were experiencing and encountering God. And these experiences and encounters shape how each understood the world that they lived in, gave birth to knowledge, insights, and possibilities. And I think this is true for all of us. What we're able to imagine as possible in the world is shaped by these kinds of experiences. And I want to say innovation flows from these experiences, as we saw with the examples of the women religious orders keeping their colleges alive. And as I learn more and more about mercy, I'm starting to appreciate that the Ignatian lens through which I've understood the world is just that, a lens. I've noticed how words that I've heard in the Ignatian world is somewhat peripheral way, in somewhat peripheral ways, are central in the mercy network or in the pockets of my institution where mercy is more dominant than Jesuits. Words like relationship, hospitality, compassion. They exist in the Jesuit world, but they're not the central sort of speaking Ignatian words, if you will. A colleague at another Jesuit institution always used to say that it's about relationships, relationships, relationships. When he would say this, it would resonate with me, but the word was not one I would have understood as Ignatian. In the mercy world, I've learned that relationship is a foundational word, much like reflection, or more robustly, discernment is foundational in the Jesuit world. I know that Jesuits believe in the value of hospitality, but it's not among the first words to come to mind if one were trying to speak Ignatian. Compassion does not show up among the core values of Jesuit institutions. Not that they don't value compassion, right? But they don't. It doesn't show up as a core value, at least among the institutions that I've surveyed. But it appears among a number of mercy colleges and universities. I just want us to just take note of those kinds of things. Those are the things that are fascinating me and I'm reflecting about these days. What I'm trying to suggest and hope to articulate with greater clarity in my chapter for the volume is, as my title suggests, we need to move beyond patriarchy and look to those who have been and arguably still are marginalized in the church and society for knowledge, wisdom, insight, and innovation that their experiences make possible, but have been excluded in an exclusively patriarchal, or more accurately, white, male, cisgender, Catholic, clerical lens. We've been moving slowly beyond this lens, but I think it's important to keep in mind why. It's not, and by we, I mean Catholic colleges and universities. It is not simply because working for diversity and being inclusive is what is expected today. It is because we would be offering an impoverished form of education if we do not invite the knowledge, insight, wisdom, and innovation that comes from a diversity of lived experience to shape the kind of education we offer our students. To argue for diversity in leadership is simply to argue for ensuring that the richness that comes from such a diversity of sources finally be allowed, encouraged, actively pursued to ensure that we live more fully into the Catholic of what we call Catholic higher education. I did mean the small c Catholic in that instance. This includes learning from the ingenuity, agility, and creativity of women leaders of Catholic women's institutions who've been offering education to those who have been underserved over the years. But it includes drawing from the diversity of experiences of lay colleagues. Now, while much of the body of the writings approaches and slice of the Catholic social tradition we have been using as we've been having these series of conversations, I think what I want to draw our attention to is that we probably don't think about how heavily patriarchal, Euro-American centric the orientations in them have been, and that much of what we encounter in Catholic social teachings are documents largely written and informed by the thinking of those whose experiences are of the global north. The pontificate of Pope Francis offers us some hope, though, that we are moving beyond a particular form of patriarchy, at least. I don't want to overstate this, but it seems to me that the first Latin American Pope, the first Pope from the global South, is offering something different. Okay, I have to mention this here. Many have said that this difference is because Francis is also the first Jesuit Pope. A former colleague at Seattle University, Jeanette Rodriguez, would always counter this. And she would always say, nope, it's because he's Latin American. It is only now that I'm swimming in Jesuit mercy waters that I'm coming to a deeper appreciation of Jeanette's words. One of the striking things I noticed from the first encyclical Pope Francis released in his name is how filled it is with examples of challenges so close to the ground, to daily life. Then it became apparent that he wanted to draw from the wisdom of bishops from around the globe. He quoted conferences of bishops from the continents. He opened Laudato Si, drawing on the wisdom of the Patriarch Bartholomew, and Fratelli Tutti from Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb, making clear through action his conviction that wisdom comes from other religious traditions. As someone whose theological area of interest, as Mike has mentioned, is religion and science on the one hand and liberation theology on the other, I appreciate Francis's repeated call to draw on the knowledge offered by different disciplines, different sources, different organizations, different cultures, different communities. And while dialogue has not been traditionally named when listing principles of Catholic social teachings, I think what Pope Francis has contributed to CST invites a consideration of dialogue as an important principle for all we do, especially in higher education. It is what is called for to draw on the riches that come from diversity. It is what inclusion looks like, and it is what will make it possible to discern how we move forward to create equity. Dialogue. Genuine dialogue describes, as Pope Francis describes it, invites recognizing the dignity of persons. It is the path to determine common good. It is the skill that our students need to bring about change and work for justice. It is the approach that leaders need to take, whether in our institutions, society, or church, to begin to actualize the other principles of Catholic social teachings. Women and many lay leaders in Catholic higher education bring experiences and voices that have long been overlooked in the church and in American Catholic higher education. In the current landscape of higher education, with the decreasing population of traditional college students, there's lessons to be learned, like the lessons we learn from Catholic women's colleges and universities, particularly as they speak to attending to serving and innovating to serve the underserved. There's a lot to learn there, and that includes bringing in this diversity of voices. I have to say, I fell in love with Pope Francis's metaphor of the polyhedron to describe the possibility of bringing together a multiplicity of voices, right? He talked about it in the context of globalization, but understood to be multicultural rather than homogenizing. It intends to illustrate the invitation to preserve the richness of cultures or diversity of voices rather than the flattening out of difference that might be expressed by a sphere where everything is homogenized. And I think that image helps me understand what the notion of moving beyond patriarchy means. It's just recognizing these other facets and bringing them to bear. Now allow me to quickly shift and talk more about moving beyond patriarchy by turning to the question of lay leadership. Throughout much of my presentation, I've been talking about the women religious orders and the institutions they sponsored. And I have to say, while technically women religious are also lay because they're not clerics, I know that what we often understand by this term are those of us who are not valid religious. And while many Catholic colleges and universities have welcomed many lay leaders, the shifting demographic landscape with regard to the presence of the religious at these institutions offers an increasing challenge to ensuring the continuity of the mission and identity of these colleges and universities. After all, the time of having Father X or Sister Y or the community of fathers, sisters, and brothers to ensure the mission and identity of our institutions is fast fading. And more of those who have received the needed credentials for leadership are increasingly less and less familiar with the Catholic intellectual tradition that they are, by virtue of being leaders at such institutions, they're supposed to preserve, hand on, and enliven. And often they're even less familiar with the stories of the founding orders and their charisms until they enter the institution. And within the polyhedron that I've applauded, some of these faces must be able to bring experience and knowledge of the Catholic intellectual tradition and the story and charism of the founders. As language like service, solidarity, and the common good find their way into the marketing strategies of even state institutions, Catholic colleges and universities must be able to continue to articulate and draw from an understanding of the long tradition from which we draw out these values. But it cannot simply be knowledge of the tradition. It must be appreciation, experience, and commitment. And allow me here very quickly just to offer a few quick thoughts. Many of us know that engagement with the Catholic social tradition is often one of the easiest entry points for bringing lay colleagues into the conversation that introduces them to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Shared commitment to social justice is what often draws many in. I'm discovering more and more that however faculty may feel about the Catholic Church, they're willing to engage the intellectual tradition. I think many of us in Catholic higher education see this in our institutions. Often we lament the shared concern for social justice is often without connection to the Catholic social tradition that grounds this commitment for us. This is why I want to suggest that Land O'Lakes might have had it right in emphasizing the importance of having a robust theology alive at the institution, which includes a meaningful engagement with Catholic social thought as part of what informs the way institutions engage social justice. Finally, with regard to forming lay leaders more broadly, allow me to share my experience at Seattle University, which, by the way, was the first Jesuit institution of higher learning in the United States to go co-ed in 1935. The institution has the distinction of having had two Jesuits in their community who have helped draft documents on lay collaboration and on women in the 34th General Congregation of the Society of Jesus in 1995. And here I'm remembering the late Pat Howell, and I'm thinking of President Steve Sundberg. At Seattle, you had the privilege of benefiting from well-crafted programs that formed lay colleagues by introducing them to the story of Ignatius, the Society of Jesus, and the university, providing opportunities not only to experience the spiritual exercises, but learn to accompany others through them. We even had opportunities to go on immersion as faculty, staff, and administrators. they've been asking the question of how to prepare lay leaders, not only to step into leadership as fewer and fewer Jesuits become available, but to be able to prepare the second generation of lay leaders, those who will work with very few Jesuits or maybe never encounter a Jesuit. Many programs have been created and offered either with lay partnership or fully by lay colleagues. And I feel like now I'm just advertising. I want to also name the Ignatian Colleagues Program, right, which is an 18-month program for administrators and faculty of the AJCU institutions. Again, the program offers similar kinds of experiences. Finally, why not? One more ad. I want to mention Collegium, right, which offers an opportunity to dive into faith and the intellectual life through a week-long program that engages mind and heart, building community while offering participants opportunities to learn, reflect, and pray together. Okay, I'm going to toot my own horn here. This year, through a grant from the West Midwest community of the Sisters of Mercy, I've had the privilege of creating and co-leading a program inspired by my experiences with Ignatian Colleagues Program and Collegium. It felt critical to begin to form a cohort of lay colleagues first in the Mercy tradition at a dually sponsored institution where a number of participated in national Ignatian formation programs already well in place. These are just, and so it was important to ensure that there was knowledge and understanding and experience of the Mercy tradition as well. All of these are just examples of initiatives intended to ensure that there continues to be a cohort of lay mission leaders at the institutions that can be those parts of the polyhedron that hands-on and faithfully adapts the traditions and charisms of founding communities and the church in the continually changing landscape of higher education, which includes the increasing number of lay leaders at these institutions. So these are my initial thoughts. I'm looking forward to Kathleen, your insights and your thoughts on how we might move this conversation forward.
Catherine, thank you. First of all, for your kind words, but just for this process, I have so relished the time we've spent. I look forward to this evening for a couple of weeks, and I look forward to our conversations that will follow. Just a word to the audience that might not know a lot about my background, just the quick part that Mike reiterated. I'm a sociologist. I have taught peace studies, and I also have a background in international relations. So I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, as many of my good friends are. I've been at 3 different institutions, Notre Dame, Georgetown, and now, of course, Loyola. So 2 Jesuit and 1 CSE. What I'd like to do is focus my response in 4 categories based on Catherine's reflections and invite more conversation, clearly for the 2 of us, but for the rest of you as well. So first, Catherine mentions the Land O'Lakes document. Until she and I started to talk about it, I hadn't reread that document in ages. It came out in 1967, and I had to look at it when I was at Notre Dame for a long period of time. But I hadn't noticed exactly what she said, who wasn't involved, who was not mentioned, especially women, and obviously the women's colleges, because the focus was on universities. And it's an important context to remember. Catherine mentioned theology, and Land O'Lakes is clear. There must be a strong theology department, and it must be in dialogue. I will note as well, it does say there should be no theological or philosophical imperialism. Please note, my dear philosopher and theologian friends, it's the interdisciplinary dialogue that just captured my heart, I must admit, because we've had so many conversations about what does interdisciplinarity mean. This document talks quite seriously about it's got to be dialogue between the disciplines. You get mutual enrichment, you get total dialogue, you get creative dialogue. So I want to just suggest, Catherine, we ought to think more about, might we imagine a new working document, one that's about institutions, not just select universities, of Catholic higher education that brings in those missing institutions, those missing voices, and consults widely with them in creating a new working document. I think we could have some fun thinking about that. Second, the dual sponsored institutions that you now serve. Jesuit and mercy, and their animating charisms. You yourself are trilingual, bicultural. You've lived in the Philippines and the US. One of the concepts that we use a lot in sociology and other disciplines as well is intersectionality, a concept created by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989. You are a woman of color, a bicultural scholar. We have to remember that there are multiple facets of identities and we can't just pigeonhole one. We have to take into account all of them as we're trying to do the work we do. Your experience, Catherine, I would argue, can and must help expand the framework for thinking and doing a dual-sponsored institution. If UDM wants to be more than a historical artifact, but rather a living, evolving tradition, you have so much to contribute to that conversation. And I remember one of our conversations dealt with, in part, the idea of self-giving to the community, an experience you had had in the Philippines. I do hope you'll think more about that and present it. I think it would be a terrific contribution in that conversation as we go forward on dual-sponsored institutions. My two other comments on this one. One is you used at the very beginning of what I lovingly learned, our Venn diagram. Now I have to tell you, I learned it in taking a course called Symbolic Logic at the St. Catherine's then College, now University of St. Catherine's. And of course, as students, we called it Symbol Limbo. I remember nothing except Venn diagrams, and they've changed my life. So in your case, you obviously have mercy, you have Jesuit, they have some overlap, and you've been talking about some of the core values. What do they share? What do they not? And how does that fullness enrich what UDM is all about? And then I would say you actually use the word speak Ignatian. Some of you may know about a little document that comes out of Xavier University called Do You Speak Ignatian? And I have to tell you, I've used it any number of times with faculty, staff, student, colleagues, just for people who say, I really don't get what we're talking about. It's a lovely cheat sheet. And I want to suggest, Catherine, if there isn't one at UDM, now that you're working on that program, maybe we could have a cheat sheet that you could do on Do You Speak Mercy? Anyway, we'll have fun talking about that one as well, I think. Third, your comments on forming lay leadership and the examples, the strong programs at Seattle, ICP, the Collegium, and the one that you're working on now, all important. My own experience, there are colleges and universities that are struggling with this, designing programs to help lay formation as the number of religious on the communities, in the communities decrease in number. Who will carry the mission forward? What's the point? Well, the point is that if we want Catholic and Jesuit, Mercy, Franciscan, Dominican, that combination, whatever it might be, if we want those identities to thrive, they will only thrive if lay people see that that identity is their own. Committed to them, as you've said, eager to help make them real and manifest in the life of the university. Now, not everyone at the institution needs to do this, but we need a significant core if the charisms, if the traditions are in fact going to live beyond the depletion of the numbers of Jesuits, Franciscans, Mercy, etc. My concern in this area, I will admit, has been for a long time. How do we entice faculty, staff, and administrators to get involved, as you would say, Catherine, in well-crafted programs? Time matters. If our institutions are serious about this, then we have to honor that reality in more than lip service. We can't keep adding to people's work life and say, well, you can do this, can't you also do this? No. So for example, with faculty, perhaps course release for staff and administrators, their work to do this mission work is part of their work. So we can't ask them to do it in their spare time. There isn't a spare time to the mission. It is central, and we have to honor that reality in the lives of those that we're asking to step up and help us make it more viable. Fourth, the issue of women, as seen in your hopes for Pope Francis in a number of his documents, without a doubt. And you're so right to point out his emphasis on dialogue. Again, Land O'Lakes, but Francis has certainly lifted it up in terms of CST, and I'm hopeful you'll write more on it. We'll all talk more about that as we proceed, and the importance of the different disciplines and the metaphor of the polyhedron. I want to applaud all that, and we'll cite two actions in particular related to women. But first, I want to express my deep concern with the Pope, whom I love, don't misunderstand me, but it's his understanding of the role of women in the church. A couple of good things, and I will share them in a moment. But it's the tenacity with which he and the others in the hierarchy cling to adamant opposition to what they have called gender ideology. There's no recognition of a distinction between sex and gender. God created males and females, period. This is challenging for those of us in and outside of the church, I would argue, whether biologists, anthropologists, sociologists, or parents of newborns that don't fit those categories, or whose children come to understand themselves as not the way some describe them, as immutably something that they don't believe is true for them. So the issue, can that topic be discussed, explored, developed in Catholic colleges and universities or not? What is academic freedom a la Land of Lakes? And I want to quote from that document. Hence, the university should carry on a continual examination of all aspects and all activities of the church and should objectively evaluate them. Let me turn now to the two recent actions by the Pope that suggest what I would call progress. First is in his recent apostolic letter, Spiritus Domini, where he basically has changed church law to make explicit that lay women can act as readers and altar servers in liturgical celebrations. While lots of us have been acting as such, it is now official, and that is not to be dismissed. This is an important first. But he continues to reaffirm Pope John Paul II's ban on women's ordination to the priesthood. As I said a minute ago, and I repeat here, can that topic be discussed, explored in Catholic colleges and universities or not? So that's the first document, Spiritus Domini. Second, and what to me perhaps is the more expansive action by Pope Francis regarding women in the church. He has appointed two new undersecretaries for the Vatican's Office of the Synod of Bishops, just February 6th. One, a Xaverian sister, a French sister, Nathalie Becquois. My understanding is that she may be able to participate with the right to vote. That would be incredible. His next synod, by the way, is going to focus on synodality, and it's scheduled for October 2022. Both of those actions are important and I think could be fruitfully discussed and useful to Catholics and members of other faiths and no faith tradition in our Catholic institutions of higher learning. Let me add to this by focusing for a moment on the Jesuits. Catherine, you mentioned Decree 14 from the General Congregation in 1995, Jesuits and the situation of women in the church and civil society. An important document. I hope many will have a chance to read it. But just this March 8th, which everyone will know is International Women's Day, Superior General Arturo Sosa created a commission on the role and responsibilities of women in the Society of Jesus. It's to function for 3 years. Final report given back to the Superior General. 10 members, 6 women, 3 Jesuits, 1 layman. 2 are Americans, Donna Andrade, who is the Dean of Mission and Ministry at Fairfield College Preparatory School, and Mike Duffy, who is the director of the McGrath Institute for Jesuit Catholic Education at the University of San Francisco. I'm hopeful that this 3-year process will yield new ideas and actions for men and women at Jesuit universities and other institutions from the prep schools all the way up. So conclusion, thank you, Catherine, for sparking so much in my own thinking and in dialoguing with you. I'm grateful and I'm excited to carry on this conversation tonight and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks so much to you both. It's really nourishing words, lots to think about there. My notes are full. I don't even know where to begin. I would encourage our crowd to feel free to text me a question on the chat And I would love to read what you have to share. As of now, I have no questions. I think that sometimes happens when there is so much to chew on. The presentations go so quickly. It's already 8:05. We have about 10 minutes. So I can offer one maybe observation as maybe a question might come in. Let me think here. Yeah, so much. I would think so. Catherine, I really appreciated your navigating the charisms and the histories of the two congregations that constitute University of Detroit Mercy. I think it's an amazingly divergent in one sense, but also complementary. I mean, but not artificially so. But Catherine Mccauley's work and then the work of St. Ignatius. I wrote down though, I feel sometimes with Ignatius, and I'm not fighting for it because I have my own spirituality is certainly Ignatian, but it's also very much Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, with whom I worked for many years. Some Carmelite stuff too, and then some Dominican stuff. But I think for Ignatius, what's subtextual in his history a lot of times is his constant care for the sick. And so he's always at Manresa. He's always, he's doing his work in the cave, he's writing the exercises, but he's out, hours every day he's caring for the sick and injured. That's one thing and then when he's in Paris, he's in the studies, he's also caring for the sick and injured. And then he's always walking everywhere, which I think is important. But then in the exercises, that the relationship. So your friend talking about relationship. I've always felt that in Ignatian spirituality because of that conversation being primary in the exercises. You have the exercitant, you have the director. It's very stratified, but it is a conversation. And even the presupposition, right? That you always put the best interpretation on your conversation partner's thought, right, before you do any condemnation. So that's one thing swirling around. The other one is Pope Francis and the Southern. I love your Northern Southern Hemisphere mashup, right? In the Northern Hemisphere, for some reason, it's always like you got to have the principle first, and then you can belong to the club, right? In the Southern Hemisphere, often, it's you belong first, and then you work on the thought. And I think Pope Francis, even amidst all of his challenges, he is a person that says everybody belongs, and that's a qualified statement. So I have a bunch of questions. So any response to that, Kathleen or Catherine?
I just want to speak, Mike, to your first point about Ignatius. And the really interesting thing is, as I'm learning the charism of mercy, sometimes you end up dichotomizing a little more strongly than it's not a dichotomy. I think my intent really is my fascination with the different entry points of the two founders, right? That Ignatius, it was the months and convalescence. It was the River Cardinere and the vision of the Trinity, right? These were the places where his conversion was to God was happening. His kind of awareness of this call was happening, and that relationship really. With Catherine, it was the poor for whom she cared. It was the sick. It was the women that she was trying to help in various situations, right? That's why it's so Matthew 25. It's seeing the face of Christ. And again, it's also kind of north and south, isn't it? It's on the ground and above. And I do wonder sometimes if that has something to do with inclusion and exclusion, with margins and centers, right? And how that plays out. A lot of these are also swirling in my head, and I'm sort of trying to land on them as I continue to reflect and to think. But so the only point there, I think that Detroit Mercy has survived dually sponsored for 30 years because there are so much in common. As a new mission officer at the institution, for me, the exciting part is not only to name what's in common, but even how different the distinctiveness of these commonalities even, right? And then what's emphasized. I think I shared with Kathleen a metaphor as we were kind of reflecting. It was the metaphor of we've kind of traditionally shone a light on one spot, right? And this is sort of the patriarchal, the kind of centers, that the center that's kind of dominated a lot of our thinking and a lot of culture and a lot of the globe, really. And the idea of moving beyond patriarchy that we're talking about, and I think the idea of moving beyond certain forms of leadership is expanding that, and sort of, if you had a ray of light, shining light on other things, right? It's not that they're missing, but they're shining light on other things. And as much as I'm in danger of ruining Pope Francis's polyhedron metaphor, but shining light, if it's two-dimensional, if it's a two-dimensional surface on a two-dimensional space, will still have a center. So it's shining light on a two-dimensional surface in a three-dimensional space. If you think of that, there is no center. It's a matter of shifting where you look, right? And I think that's kind of what's at play, even as I think about Ignatius and Catherine. What's getting centered and what's not.
I am chuckling because I love hearing your physics background come in here, Catherine. You're spatially arranging things that's so perfect, though. So that's good work for you to do. And I think we keep talking. You know, since we've been talking, Catherine and Kathleen, my questions have blown up here. So I want to get some people in. Heidi Bostick, would you mind, could we unmute Heidi Bostick, Megan, and have her ask her question? What's the question?
So, hi everyone. Yeah, thanks,
Hi,
Michael.
Heidi.
So the question was, there seems to be a need alluded to here to rethink a theology of the body. I was just wondering if there are any comments about how these different charisms could illuminate this rethinking the theology of the body.
It's interesting. My intuition in responding to that is going back to the idea of just imagining the Sisters of Mercy and how attending to the people in front of them is sort of what I'm learning as their starting point. And again, this is also very Ignatian and very Jesuit. I don't want to underplay that. The Sisters of Mercy are the new things for me. But I wonder, as we're thinking about something like the theology of the body, or how we're thinking, and I know we're speaking about a specific theology there, but even how we're thinking about some of the things that Kathleen pointed out around gender and sexuality, how the voices of persons, of individuals and lived experience are informing that, right? And so is experience the starting point, or are principles the starting point that are dictating how we're understanding experiences? And I think that's, in that sense, I think there's something about women religious communities, for example, starting on the ground, that may inform how we might approach doing something like that. I hope that kind of begins to speak to it, to the question.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Heidi? Heidi's still muted. That's okay. Hey, Catherine, thank you. Kathleen Maas Weigert, any thoughts?
This theology of the body is one of those areas where I've done some tangential reading, but as a sociologist, it makes me exceedingly nervous when people start essentializing things. So if we're going to essentialize male bodies and essentialize women's bodies, I think we're going down the wrong path. So I have a little squeamishness trying to get theology around body, unless the idea of body is much more expansive than what I think Catherine has pointed out and what the tradition has said, and what I acknowledge again: male, female, end of statement.
Thanks, Kathleen. Okay, next person, Elsie Miranda. Can we unmute Elsie? Hi, Elsie.
Hi. So I just to contextualize my question, I taught at a Catholic university for 22 years, and now I'm in accrediting. So I visit all kinds of schools, many of them Catholic. I'm the only Catholic accreditor at the association. And I am continuously just flabbergasted by how popular these right-wing leaning Orthodox schools are, the number of students that they have, the amount of money that they have, and how much there's this appeal for obedience and certitude. And it breaks my heart personally, but I have to do my job independent of how I feel about them. But I'm always pressed for thinking, and I love this conversation. How can we package Catholic social thought? How can the more progressive, free-thinking Jesuit, Mercy, Dominican communities come together with the intention of really making the message of Christ and the gospel simple, more digestible? People want a very catechetical kind of formation, and there's a huge market for it, and I mean, I love this conversation. We can talk for weeks, but I'm concerned that the people who are hungry and desirous of consuming a simple articulation of faith, they don't get this.
Thank you, Elsie, very much. Does there a response at all from Catherine or Kathleen? Thank you, Elsie.
Just a couple of thoughts. My first thought is that there is such a desire for certainty, absolute certainty and clarity, in a world that has so much ambiguity, right, in our times, and with so much change and such rapid change. And so there's a genuine human hunger. I think I'm not. This is not Catherine with any kind of expertise. This is Catherine sort of as a Catholic reflecting and someone who teaches reflecting. There's that hunger for certainty, and we know that there's sort of a swing, right, in terms of where young people are going. It's either that you get very, very evangelical, traditional conservative, or you leave, right? Faith traditions. And what's in the middle, interestingly, is what I think these like the Society of Jesus, the Sisters of Mercy, and these other religious orders and traditions and their spiritualities invite is the hard thing, right? Which is discernment and attending to how God speaks in our lives, and that deep, genuine listening. And the reality of assuming, at least, again, this is where being a woman Filipina comes in, right, with sort of this transcultural experience, that sometimes easy formulas, they don't resonate with my lived experience because they're framed and formulated for a culture and a worldview and a reality that's different from mine. I'm not speaking about being relativistic. All I'm saying is what often are clear-cut formula for some still need to be translated, right? And still need to be understood through various lenses. So what appears as certain for some may still nevertheless remain ambiguous for others. I guess, and for me, the important point is, again, the hard part is to accept the freedom that we've been given to really discern how God is moving in the world and in our lives and how we're called. That's hard work, and hard work. It requires commitment, right? And as I listen to you, I'm also thinking, on the ground with people, that's where the gospel is lived, right? So there's also that sense, and what those kinds of encounters often can do for transforming the experiences of young people.
Catherine, that's exactly the point I was going to make, your last point. I'm a believer in experiential education. We've got to displace students, faculty, staff, all of us. We need other opportunities to reflect and to be challenged and to wonder why. And I think that really comes with experiences. So if we could shape more of those, it's back to your idea, Catherine, of well-crafted programs. I don't mean just send them out, although the Jesuits do that still. So we need to do things like that, I think, Elise, to get at this. I really do.
Thank you both. Gosh, Kathleen, I love that too. Experiential, I'm a both-ander. So I like experiential learning, but the intellectual rigor to reflect on it too, I think, is needed.
It's
Catherine,
essential, Mike. That's an essential part of good experiential education. It is not just the experience,
Right.
it is the prep, the reflection. Yeah, the whole thing has.
Can I just jump in just really, really quick on that as well?
Yeah.
For those of us in Catholic higher education, and to begin to realize when we're talking about experiential learning, and I think this is where some of my thinking around diversity and inclusion comes in as well, is it's not always just the experience of those realities outside of our institutions, but the reality of the people who are within our institutions, right? We often, I think, make assumptions about who's in the room in our colleges and universities, who's within the institution. And again, we need to be aware of the changing demographics of our students that are already inside, and also the necessity to change the internal demographics, right? Because the decreasing population of traditional undergraduate students and the reality of a lot of others who have traditionally been underserved, who desire to have the experience of higher education. So as we're thinking about that, we need to think about those factors as well.
Yeah, really important. You know, you made me think of Ignacio Correa, who actually says that the center of the university is not in the university. It's where in the margins where the people in need are. Also, real quick, Catherine, I was thinking about Simone Weil with your attending to God, l'attente de Dieu. You know, it's a being present to and listening. Really wonderful. I have so many questions. We're over time. I'm just going to read a couple and then ask Gabrielle Buckley to have the last word. So we can unmute Gabrielle. Gabrielle, I just want to read a couple here so you know what's out there. Rosemary Malloy, she writes, she's a graduate of University of St. Joseph in Connecticut. She says, which is Sisters of Mercy College, or University, excuse me. She says, I realized that I never thought in terms of the charism of the sister president and the sisters who were professors there. She never thought that as having a charism. I always thought in terms of their individualities. Now I will spend some time thinking of the mercy charism. That's great, Rosemary. And then Heidi Villaluz, she says, she didn't want to ask this aloud anyway, so I feel okay there. She says, Catholic colleges and universities can often exist as a sanctuary of Catholic thought, but also a silo inaccessible to most of the faithful. What impact would you like the programs and ideas you mentioned to have on the life of the diocese surrounding these universities as a center of culture and thought? That's an awesome question. Any thoughts by Kathleen, Catherine? Any quick thoughts there?
Yes.
Go ahead, Kathleen. Go ahead, Kathleen.
You've been given the floor, Kathleen.
I was being funny, just saying yes to all of that. More conversation. No, that's it.
Yes, let's please be in conversation, not just inside our universities, but with the broader community, both the local church communities as well as the broader communities we find are in universities. Yes, yes, yes.
All right, amen. Gabrielle Buckley, welcome to our midst.
Thank you. I'm the director of the Gannon Center for Women in Leadership at Loyola, and I would like to ask a really simple question. My background is actually in law, so I do not have the theology background that many of you have. But my question really is, what do you think would be the ideal conclusions to be reached by the GC Decree 14 Commission? I know what my ideal conclusions would be, but I'm interested in others' opinions.
I'd say feel free to. I mean, I would. You know, do you want to say what yours would be, Gabrielle? I don't, not to put you on the spot.
I think I better not get on the spot.
Okay, fair enough. Any thoughts, Kathleen?
Do you do mean the new commission that's just
Yes,
being formed, not the GC 34? My hope personally is that they're going to do a lot of consulting. Those 10 people aren't just going to sit in a room and talk to each other. They're going to, and if you don't know Mike Duffy, get to know Mike Duffy and he'll listen. I would like to see that kind of inclusion in the very process. I would like them to suggest various experiments that they would like to see people take up and try. Nothing definitive, say if you do these 3 things, it's all over. But what about this kind of a combination? Could we get large schools and small schools to do more together in terms of programs and sharing resources? Oh, I've often thought about this when Notre Dame is, you know, the big kahuna, and I think there are 4 other CSE schools. Do they ever share resources? Well, could this commission share resources and urge others to share them on? Let's have mentoring programs. Maybe somebody who's kind of like the ICP, Catherine, I think. You know, you have a project and you have a mentor or 2 at other places. I think there are 1,000 things, Gabriel. I'd be happy to talk to you at some point in more detail, because I think this is a really important opportunity for us all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, any thoughts on that one? You're on mute. Oh, then not, now you're not.
That's an interesting question. I think that when you asked that, I just thought just to recognize just how central women already are in so many of the ministries of the Society of Jesus, and how fruitful the wisdom has that women have brought, whether it's to the exercises or to education itself, already are. And they flourish differently in different places because of the openness of these places, right? To the role of women in leadership. But in those places where they've been given the space to flourish, there is so much to learn from them already.
Could I add a footnote to that one, Catherine, because it's a right on. Dean Andrade has been in Jesuit education for 40 years. She's a Black Catholic. We already have somebody on that commission who's got incredible wealth of experience to bring to them. So I'm excited about who's on that committee as well, which I think really is a tribute to the formation of it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. You know, a final word, Kathleen Maas Weigert first, and then a final word, Catherine Punsalan-Manlimos. Thank you.
The first is Catherine, thank you. I so love our conversations. I'm looking forward to more. I'm delighted. I mean, Mike, the time just flew. I thought, good grief, there's more we can talk about. We can all talk about in different ways because we have emails and you name it. So thank you for this really fun evening, intellectually satisfying and challenging at the same time. Catherine, especially to you and the Hank Center and the Gannon Center for Women in Leadership for the co-sponsoring of it. Really, I'm so pleased to be part of it.
Yeah, and I'll just add my thanks. Kathleen, thank you for engaging me, and I do look forward to our continued engagement as well. And Mike and Megan and Kathleen and the Hank Center for hosting, and Jennifer and Bernard for getting this project going, but also to all of you just for being with us as we kind of continue thinking through. And I always want to footnote what I've shared is my reflection in progress, and there'll be continued learning every day, even after the chapter's done. And thank you for all for being part of the journey.
That's a great last word. So I thank you. Let's put our hands together for this wonderful pair of women scholars. And you can check the link out. It's available on our YouTube page, and please share it around and give us a good look. And we'll see you soon. Okay. Lenten blessings, and please be of good cheer and take good care. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Catherine. See you soon.